Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're setting aside the usual ways we measure power. Forget the World Bank stats, population counts, the sheer weight of a Navy's steel.
Yeah, we're going somewhere else entirely.
Exactly. We're diving into what some of the sources we've looked at call the moral physics of force. We're looking at how things like quality, unity, and just unshakable belief can, well, completely overcome brute force and numbers.
It's a really fascinating angle, isn't it? And pretty provocative. It really challenges how, modern defense thinking calculates strength.
Right.
The core idea, and this comes from the book The Nuclear Umbrella, is put quite powerfully. Before nuclear physics, there was moral physics. Before missiles, there was faith. So we're not just recounting history lessons here. We're treating these early Islamic victories, Badr, Yarmouk, and others, almost like case studies in strategic thinking. The aim is to really dissect how these forces built principles of deterrence and, well, force multiplication that the source argues are just timeless.
I like that term, moral physics. Let's unpack that a bit for everyone listening. Physics implies rules, right? Predictable, measurable forces.
Exactly.
So the source is basically claiming that moral conviction, this belief system, operates with similar kinds of predictable rules, that ethical clarity and purpose can somehow be calculated into the final force projection, almost exponentially.
That's precisely the argument. Our mission today is to try and extract these surprising, non-material secrets behind why these smaller forces won against overwhelming odds. We want to understand the mechanics of that force multiplier.
Okay.
And crucially, see how the author connects these ancient principles directly to modern security. Specifically drawing a line, and it's a controversial one, definitely to things like the nuclear umbrella concept today.
Right. So the key distinction, and this is important for you listening, is that we're analyzing history to see how faith is argued to have multiplied force, treating it almost like a quantifiable strategic asset, not just, good morale.
Couldn't have said it better. It's about faith as a measurable input in the strategic equation.
Okay, let's jump right in. Where does this prototype first appear?
Well, to really get the genesis of this whole strategic line of thought, you absolutely have to start with the Battle of Badr. That was back in 624 CE.
Okay.
And this wasn't just some minor skirmish. According to the analysis we're looking at, it was the definitive blueprint, the prototype for asymmetric conflict. It showed with almost brutal clarity how quality could just dominate quantity.
And the numbers paradox really sets the scene, doesn't it? The sheer disparity is, well, it's stark.
It really is.
We're talking, about 313 Muslims, not particularly well-equipped either.
Right. Many didn't even have proper armor or weapons.
Facing off against 1,000 Quraysh fighters, well-supplied, motivated, fighting for their established power, their trade routes, their standing.
Powerful motivations, definitely. They had the security of being the established power.
Mathematically, it just doesn't add up. It looks like it should have been a complete wipeout for the Muslims.
Absolutely. And that's precisely why the source material argues the victory wasn't luck, it wasn't random. It was a direct result of sticking to three timeless operational principles laid down by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
And these weren't just spiritual ideas.
No, not solely. The analysis treats them as essential tactical differentiators, things that gave them a concrete edge.
Okay, let's break them down. The first one, preparation. Now, for a small force, preparation must mean something more than just standard drills, right? It has to be intense.
Oh, absolutely. It was about achieving total functional clarity. Think about it. In a massive army, you can maybe afford some redundancy. A unit underperforms, another picks up the slack. Maybe there's some confusion.
You have buffles.
Exactly, buffers. But with only 313, every single person, every small group had to function perfectly. Peak efficiency, no errors allowed.
So preparation meant absolute clarity on roles. Everyone knew exactly what to do, where to be, and what would happen if they failed.
Precisely. It minimized complexity in the plan. It allowed for almost instant execution of orders. This intense preparation essentially turned 313 individuals into one single, cohesive unit. An organism, not just a collection of fighters.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like a precision machine. One gear breaks, the whole thing grinds to a halt. So quality here isn't just individual skill, it's that functional alignment. Very powerful.
Totally. And that leads directly into the second principle, prayer. Now, the source treats this with remarkable strategic depth. It's not just about the spiritual aspect, important as that is.
Okay.
The analysis frames prayer as a tool for achieving operational clarity.
Operational clarity. How does faith give a battlefield advantage beyond just, boosting morale? What's the mechanism?
Well, according to the source, when a soldier is deeply focused through prayer and conviction, A couple of critical military advantages emerge. First, it helps eliminate that internal friction, fear, self-doubt, the temptation to run. You're fighting for something bigger than just staying alive.
Right, the focus shifts outward.
Exactly. And second, maybe even more critical tactically, it creates a kind of stillness, a calm focus, right in the middle of utter chaos. This spiritual focus translates directly into better decision-making under extreme pressure. Think about the Quraysh. Maybe some panicked, hesitated when things didn't go as expected. But the 313, supposedly fueled by this deep operational clarity, they maintained their discipline, their cohesion.
So if the enemy starts losing focus, getting confused, panicking, but the smaller force stays absolutely calm and focused, their effective striking power goes way up. It's almost like a cognitive edge. They're fighting the enemy's confusion as much as the enemy themselves.
That's a great way to put it, cognitive edge. And this connects straight into the third principle, which might be the most decisive one, purpose. The source really hammers this point. The Muslims fought for truth, not territory. Their objective was fundamentally moral, not material.
That distinction feels huge. Fighting for truth versus fighting for land or money. That must drastically change your commitment level.
It's presented as the ultimate force multiplier, the one you can't just manufacture or buy. The Quraysh, they fought for wealth, trade routes, tribal standing. If those things looked too costly to defend, maybe they'd cut their losses, retreat, negotiate.
There's a point where it's not worth it anymore.
Right. But when your fight is framed as being for truth, for a moral imperative, the calculation just changes completely. Retreat isn't really an option in the same way. There's no acceptable cost for failure.
So that translates into maximum endurance, maximum offensive spirit, even when you're outnumbered.
That's the argument.
Yeah.
Absolute commitment equals tenacity. And the source backs this up by pointing to the Quran, Surah al-Baqarah, verse 249. How many a small group overcame a large one by permission of Allah?
So this isn't just seen as scripture, but as a kind of foundational military doctrine, proven by history.
Yes, the source presents it exactly like that. A doctrine stating that quality, backed by divine permission and this focused moral purpose, inherently beats quantity. So Badr becomes more than just a battle won. It's framed as the first lesson in Islamic deterrence. It demonstrated that even a small force could massively multiply its physical strength, not through better swords or shields, they didn't have those, but through a superior internal structure, preparation, focus, purpose. It set the stage, the source argues, for relying on these qualitative factors for future security.
Okay, so Badr was the blueprint, the initial stunning success. But the story doesn't just stop there, right? The path wasn't perfectly smooth.
Not at all. And that's where the next key battles, Uhud and Khandaq, come in. They provided really crucial corrections and refinements to the doctrine that emerged from Badr. They shift the focus a bit from just winning to the absolute necessity of discipline and resilience.
Uhud first, then. That was just a year after Badr, 625 CE. You said it's a cautionary tale.
A powerful one, yeah. It serves as this profound reminder that discipline is like the fragile connection holding that whole force multiplier concept together. Badr built confidence, maybe even overconfidence. Uhud showed the immediate devastating price of disobeying orders.
What happened tactically? Walk us through the breakdown. How did they lose the advantage they initially had?
Okay, so the Muslims initially had a strong position. They'd set up archers on a crucial hill or pass overlooking the battlefield. And their orders from the Prophet, peace be upon him, were crystal clear. Hold that position, no matter what. Whether it looked like they were winning or losing down below, stay put.
Explicit orders, don't move.
Don't move. But then, early in the battle, the Muslims seemed to be gaining the upper hand. The Quraysh lines started to waver, looked like they might be retreating.
And temptation kicked in.
Exactly. A number of the archers saw this, thought the battle was basically over, and rushed down the hill to grab spoils of war. They abandoned their posts.
Ah, so the material lure, the spoils, overrode the moral and operational command, which was discipline.
Precisely, and that single act of indiscipline created a massive gaping hole in their strategy. The Quraysh cavalry commander, Khalid ibn al-Walid, who ironically later became a legendary Muslim general himself.
Right, you mentioned him.
He spotted the opening instantly, saw the flank was totally exposed. He wheeled his cavalry around, charged right through that now unguarded pass, and smashed into the main Muslim force from behind.
Oof. Instant reversal.
Total reversal of momentum. It became a near disaster.
That's a brutal lesson in resilience, isn't it? It shows that organization, obedience, they aren't just nice to haves, they're fundamental. especially for a smaller force relying on quality. A big army might absorb a mistake like that.
But an asymmetric force, it relies on near-perfect execution. The source's analysis here is basically that this battle proves lack of discipline cancels everything else out. It can negate the strongest conviction, the best initial plan, that moral physics only functions if the mechanism, the chain of command, the obedience holds firm.
So Uhud taught that organization is as sacred as courage itself.
Beautifully put. As sacred as courage. Okay, so then we move to Khandaq, the Battle of the Trench, in 627 CE. Here you see the lesson of Uhud, the need for discipline integrated with some really innovative strategic thinking.
And the odds here were even worse, weren't they?
Way worse. About 3,000 Muslims facing this huge coalition force. Estimates vary, but around 10,000 attackers. A massive confederation of tribes united against Medina.
So how did they approach this overwhelming force?
This battle is really the ultimate example of defensive engineering as a force multiplier. The strategy, suggested by Salman the Persian, was revolutionary for Arabia at the time. The Prophet, peace be upon him, approved it, and they dug a huge trench, the Khandaq, around the most vulnerable approach to Medina.
A trench. Seems simple, but was it?
It wasn't just a ditch, it was a serious military obstacle, wide enough and deep enough to stop cavalry charges cold. And cavalry was the main shock weapon of the attacking coalition.
So it neutralized their primary strength. The massive numbers of horsemen were rendered, well, useless.
Pretty much useless for a direct assault, yeah. The trench completely stopped their preferred tactic, the rapid cavalry charge meant to break enemy lines. The huge coalition army was basically immobilized on the other side.
Forced into a siege.
Exactly. A prolonged siege, which they were totally unprepared for. They didn't have the unified command, the logistics, the supply lines needed to sustain that kind of operation for long, especially in the worsening weather.
And the outcome. This is maybe the most interesting part strategically.
Victory was achieved without a big, decisive, pitched battle. There were skirmishes, duels, attempts to cross, but no full-scale engagement like Badr or Uhud. The enemy coalition just frayed, frustrated by the trench, running low on supplies, freezing, internal disagreements bubbling up among the different tribes. Eventually, they just packed up and left.
Wow, so the victory came through strategic patience and engineering, not just fighting prowess.
That's the powerful synthesis here. Khandaq showed that brilliant strategy, like the trench, could neutralize numerical superiority by taking away the enemy's main weapon. Uhud showed that executing any strategy requires absolute discipline.
So the source ties these together.
Yes, concluding that organization and obedience are, again, as sacred as courage. They become the practical ways that this abstract moral physics actually works on the ground. They allow the conviction to translate into real military success.
Okay, so we've seen the prototype at Badr, the crucial lessons in discipline from Uhud, and the strategic innovation at Khandaq. Now, let's take these principles and see them applied on a truly epic scale. The Battle of Yarmouk in 636 CE.
Yes, Yarmouk is where this concept of asymmetric victory goes from, significant regional battles to something that reshapes empires. It's a foundational event in military history, full stop.
And the scale, the military imbalance is just mind-boggling, even more so than Badr's or Khandaq.
It's staggering, really. You have to double-check the numbers. We're talking about roughly 40,000 Muslims facing a massive professional army of the Byzantine Empire, Eastern Roman Empire, basically.
One of the two global superpowers of the time.
Exactly. And their army size. The sources we're looking at estimate it at around 240,000 soldiers.
240,000. Against 40,000. That's 6-to-1 odds. How? How is victory even conceivable against that kind of disparity? This isn't just tribal levies anymore.
No, this is the professional, highly organized Roman military machine. And the source material attributes the seemingly impossible victory directly to the strategic brilliance of one man, primarily, Khalid ibn al-Walid.
The same commander who exploited the weakness at Uhud for the Quraysh.
The very same. Now fighting for the Muslims and known as Saif Allah, the sword of Allah. His approach, according to this analysis, wasn't about static defense like Khandaq. It was about pure maneuver dominance.
Maneuver dominance. Okay, break that down. What did that involve?
Khalid understood, fundamentally, that just trying to hold a line against those numbers was suicide. He couldn't afford a battle of attrition. He had to dictate the fight. He had to force the massive Byzantine army to constantly react to his moves, his tempo, not the other way around.
Get inside their decision cycle.
Precisely. His strategy rested on three core interconnected elements that really amplified the discipline and quality of his smaller force. First was fast mobility.
Speed as a weapon.
Absolutely. leveraging speed as an explicit component of strength. Khalid was already legendary for this. Before Yarmouk, he'd famously force-marched his army across the waterless Syrian desert in a surprise move that completely changed the strategic situation.
Unheard of at the time.
Basically. At Yarmouk, this translated into tactical speed. His forces were lighter, could move faster, change formation quicker than the heavy, more cumbersome Byzantine legions. This constant rapid movement created uncertainty, confusion in the Byzantine command. They never quite knew where the next blow would land.
That speed, that's the heart of maneuver warfare, isn't it? Constantly keeping the enemy off balance, making them react instead of act.
Exactly right. You mentioned the OD loop earlier. Observe, orient, decide, act. Modern military concept. The source argues Khalid was running his OD loop way faster than the Byzantines could even process what was happening.
Which leads to the second principle.
Deceptive maneuvers. Speed-enabled deception.
Okay, like what? How do you deceive an army 6 times your size on an open battlefield?
Khalid used some brilliant tactics. He had arguably the best cavalry in the world at the time. Highly mobile, disciplined. He used them in repeated, sharp, powerful counterattacks, hitting different parts of the Byzantine line. It made it seem like he had far more reserves than he actually did.
Creating the illusion of depth.
Yes. He also constantly shifted his formations, used flanking movements, feints, anything to confuse the enemy about his true strength and intentions. There's even a mention in some accounts of how the women and children who were with the camp were organized behind the lines.
Really? How did that play in?
Their role was reportedly to shame or physically prevent any Muslim soldiers who might think about retreating, bolstering the line from behind. This created this psychological wall for his own troops, reinforcing their commitment while presenting this image of an absolutely unwavering, unbreakable front to the Byzantines.
That unwavering front, that leads right into the third element you mentioned, psychological warfare.
Absolutely. It all ties together. By combining these relentless, fast attacks with confusing, deceptive movements, Khalid systematically eroded the Byzantines' will to fight.
Not just their physical ability, but their morale.
Exactly. The Byzantine commanders, despite having overwhelming numbers on paper, could never seem to gain control of the battle. They couldn't impose their plan. Imagine the frustration, the growing doubt. Morale just starts to crumble under that kind of relentless, unpredictable pressure.
So once the enemy loses faith in their own numbers and their command structure is paralyzed by confusion, the battle is essentially won even before the final clashes.
That's the core idea. Khalid didn't just physically defeat the Byzantine army through attrition he couldn't have. He defeated their confidence, their command cohesion, their will first.
It really sounds like a textbook definition of maneuver warfare, using movement and dislocation to shatter the enemy's coherence rather than just grinding them down physically.
And the source we're looking at draws that exact parallel. It explicitly states that what modern military thinkers now call maneuver dominance was being practiced effectively by Khalid and these early Muslim armies over 1,000 years earlier.
Remarkable.
The key takeaway from Khalid's success, as the source frames it, is this principle. Speed is strength when guided by faith. The faith provided that bedrock of discipline, clarity, and endurance needed to execute these complex, high-tempo maneuvers, and the speed was the physical tool that multiplied their force.
Okay, we've looked at how the tactics at Badr, the discipline lessons, the speed and maneuver at Yarmouk. But the source seems to argue there's a deeper layer, right? The fundamental why. What enabled these soldiers to actually pull off this level of precision, this relentless pace?
Exactly. This is where the analysis moves beyond just battlefield tactics and drills down into the core mindset, the internal engine driving these fighters.
And the source argues the ultimate secret weapon wasn't better swords or faster horses. It was character.
That's the core claim. Character, defined in a very specific way, is presented as this invisible force multiplier, something that the source argues modern superpowers can't just replicate with bigger budgets or fancier technology.
Okay, let's unpack character in this context. What does the source mean by that?
It really centers on this crucial distinction between having a moral mission versus a material mission.
Right, we touched on this with Badr.
Exactly. If a soldier's primary motivation is, say, their salary or the promise of loot or fighting for a purely political gain, their commitment inherently has a limit. There's a point where the risk might outweigh the reward.
Makes sense. Mercenary armies throughout history often folded when things got too tough or the pay wasn't good enough.
Right. Or even regular armies fighting for purely territorial gain might rationally decide to cut their losses if the cost becomes too high. But the argument here is that the soldiers at Badr, at Yarmouk, operating within this moral mission framework, they didn't have that same kind of cost-benefit analysis running.
Because the mission itself was seen as inherently valuable, beyond measure.
Precisely. Their belief that the mission was fundamentally moral, ordained, not just material or political. That's defined as the non-manufacturable advantage. This deep conviction creates a kind of unwavering tenacity, an endurance that goes beyond normal human limits. A person fighting for a principle they believe is absolute is arguably willing to endure far more, maintain discipline under greater stress, than someone just fighting for pay or territory.
That conviction becomes a strategic asset in itself, an intangible one.
An intangible but critical strategic asset.
Okay, let me push back slightly here, playing devil's advocate based on what the source is claiming. Modern armies talk a lot about patriotism, unit cohesion, professionalism, fighting for comrades. These are powerful motivators too. How does the source argue that this specific moral commitment, often rooted in faith, provides a unique military advantage that surpasses, say, intense professional dedication or fierce national pride?
That's a really important question. The source does make a distinction. It argues that while patriotism, professionalism, unit cohesion, these are all vital, absolutely, but they can sometimes be undermined by shifting political goals back home, by economic pressures, by a sense that the war is unjust or poorly led.
Okay.
The moral mission, as defined here, particularly when rooted in divine purpose, is presented as having a kind of permanence. It transcends political instability or whether the campaign is going well or badly in the short term. It creates this absolute confidence that the mission must succeed regardless of the odds.
And practically, how does that translate on the battlefield, according to the source?
In practical terms, the argument is this leads to things like lower rates of desertion, higher compliance with incredibly difficult or dangerous orders, and a greater willingness to sacrifice individual gain or even survival for the collective goal. It builds an institutional integrity, a core resilience that's very hard to just buy or train into existence through purely secular means.
So the character is the fuel. It's what allows the discipline learned the hard way at Uhud to actually stick. It's what provides the superhuman endurance needed for Khalid's relentless mobility at Yarmouk.
You could say that. The character provides the internal strength, the ethical and spiritual bedrock, and discipline is the engine that runs on that fuel.
Does the source keep this analysis purely historical?
No, and this is crucial. It explicitly connects this principle of character directly to modern times. It argues that this same ideology, this same emphasis on inner strength over sheer numbers, reappears in the philosophy underpinning Pakistan's armed forces.
Ah, okay.
Often summed up, the source notes, in the phrase, small in number, strong in faith. That phrase isn't just seen as a motto. In this analysis, it's presented as a direct, living link back to the strategic lessons of Badr and Yarmouk.
All right, now we arrive at perhaps the most expansive, and I imagine for some listeners, the most controversial leap the source material makes. It draws a direct line, an analogy, between the historical Battle of Badr and the modern defense challenges faced specifically by Pakistan.
Yes, this is where the historical analysis is explicitly bridged to contemporary geopolitics and nuclear strategy. It's a bold connection.
We're connecting 7th century asymmetric warfare, swords, arrows, faith, to 20th century nuclear deterrence. That's quite the jump.
It is. The source uses Badr, that archetype of the few defeating the many, 313 versus 1,000, as the foundational ancestor, the structural model for understanding Pakistan's national security situation.
And the modern parallel they draw is
the 1998 nuclear tests at Chagai. This moment is framed within the source, not just as a technological achievement, but as the modern equivalent of Badr, the point where Pakistan, facing a numerically and materially superior nuclear-armed India, established its own form of deterrence based on qualitative strength rather than quantitative parity.
Okay, that is a huge conceptual leap. Badr was visceral, hand-to-hand combat. Chagai involved incredibly complex physics, advanced engineering, secretive state programs. How does the source justify arguing that these two events, separated by centuries and vastly different technologies, represent the same core idea, quality defeating quantity?
The continuity, according to this argument, lies in the underlying principle of asymmetric strategy. In both scenarios, Badr and Chagai, the argument is that the entity perceived as weaker achieves security and deterrence, not by matching the opponent number for number or weapon for weapon, but by developing and leveraging a qualitative advantage that the larger power couldn't easily counter or match despite its size.
So at Badr, that quality was the combination of discipline, focus, faith, and purpose we discussed.
Exactly. And at Chagai, the source argues, the decisive quality was scientific mastery, technical excellence, and crucially, the national will and intellectual conviction to pursue and achieve that nuclear capability against immense international pressure, sanctions, and facing overwhelming conventional military odds.
Interesting. So the source sees it as a shift in the medium of the force multiplier, but the underlying principle remains the same. Faith was the multiplier in the 7th century. Advanced science became its modern expression in the 20th.
That's precisely the logic presented.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, science itself is neutral, right? It's a tool. But the source contends that the mastery and successful execution of something as complex and demanding as developing nuclear weapons, especially under resource constraints and intense opposition, that requires the same kinds of qualitative, arguably moral prerequisites seen at Badr. Intense discipline, absolute unity of purpose among the scientific and political leadership, meticulous preparation, secrecy, and an unwavering national commitment to the goal, despite the risks and costs. These are all presented as qualitative, character-driven components. The science, in this view, becomes the vehicle for national conviction, not a replacement for it.
That's a fascinating way to frame it. It implies that, according to this view, a nuclear capability developed purely through, say, immense wealth or espionage, without that deep internal conviction and institutional integrity, it might lack the same qualitative deterrent effect. The source suggests the character we talked about in the last section is needed to reliably develop, maintain, and credibly wield such technology.
That is the heart of the argument. The technological feat at Chagai is mirrored, in this analysis, by the required moral and national achievement. This synthesis, the source claims, creates a deterrence that's qualitatively different, perhaps stronger, because it's backed by an underlying national character perceived to be rooted in these enduring principles. The adversary isn't just deterred by the bomb itself, but by the perceived nature, the quality, the resolve of the nation that possesses it.
So given this historical framework leading up to the modern era, what does the source say is the path forward? What's the new Badr that needs to be fought, according to this perspective?
The source argues the future challenge for Pakistan and perhaps the wider Muslim world must be met with a conscious synthesis. It needs unity, technology, and conviction. All three.
Not just one or the other.
No. It's the marriage of what it calls moral physics. The conviction, the unity, the discipline with nuclear physics, the technology, the scientific capability. The argument is stark. Relying solely on faith without modern capability is naive, but relying solely on technology without the underlying moral strength and unity is ultimately hollow and vulnerable. Permanent security requires reinforcing the physical with the moral, moving beyond just national borders towards a deeper, unified purpose.
That careful framing seems necessary to make that huge leap from a 7th century battle to a 20th century nuclear test site plausible within their argument. The core message seems to be material limitations become secondary if the underlying moral architecture is strong and unified.
So after tracing this line of thought across, nearly 14 centuries, let's try and boil down the key lessons presented in the source. What are the practical takeaways for you, the listener, whether thinking about security, politics, or even just how organizations function effectively?
Right. We identified 4 main lessons that the source distills from this historical analysis and applies to today. Let's revisit the first one. The idea that unity of purpose is more important than unity of borders.
Yeah, this is a really potent political and strategic statement. The argument is that getting too hung up on just defending geographical lines or national sovereignty, while important, can miss the bigger picture.
How so?
Because the real enduring security of any group, whether it's a nation, an alliance, maybe even a company, depends more fundamentally on its internal cohesion, on having shared, deeply held goals. If the purpose is fuzzy or fragmented, that force multiplier we talked about just evaporates. You end up like that big, unwieldy coalition besieging Medina at Khandaq.
Yeah.
Impressive on paper, but ultimately ineffective because they lacked a truly unified purpose.
So shared moral purpose acts as a stronger defense than a physical wall.
That's the provocative claim, a more reliable defense perimeter. Okay, the second lesson circles back to Uhud and Khandaq. Training and discipline matter more than sheer numbers.
This feels incredibly relevant today, with things like cyber warfare, hybrid threats, where small, highly skilled, disciplined teams can potentially wreak havoc.
Absolutely. The source argues that a large organization, be it an army, a government, a corporation, if it's poorly organized, riddled with internal politics, or lacks discipline, it's inherently fragile, vulnerable,
Regardless of size or budget.
regardless. So quality assurance and training, rigorous standards, and crucially, obedience to the mission, not to individual ambition or C-suite politics, that's the bedrock of lasting security and effectiveness. The offers at Uhud are the timeless example. One small lapse in discipline cascades into strategic failure, no matter how strong you seemed initially.
Okay, lesson 3. This was the big synthesis we just discussed. Faith combined with technology equals permanent security.
This is really the core thesis on deterrence, as presented in the source. You need both halves. You need the material capability, the technology, the weapons, the infrastructure, to pose a credible physical threat or defense.
The hard power.
Right. But the argument goes that hard power must be guided and wielded by the non-material conviction, the faith, the moral strength, the national will to ensure it's used decisively when necessary, but also responsibly and ethically. The two have to reinforce each other. Technology provides the means, but the moral purpose directs its effective use and makes the deterrent truly credible and lasting.
Which leads directly to the final takeaway, the ultimate point, looping back to where we started with moral physics. Moral strength is the true weapon of mass protection.
Yeah, this positions ethics, moral certainty, the perceived rightness of the cause as the ultimate defensive shield. It suggests that things like institutional integrity, a known lack of corruption, an unwavering public commitment to core principles. These signal a level of resolve that an adversary might find daunting.
More daunting than just tanks or missiles.
Perhaps, because it creates an intangible deterrent. The adversary might hesitate, not just because of the physical risk, but because they perceive they're facing an opponent who is morally prepared to endure anything, to fight to the absolute end for their principles. It changes the psychological calculus of conflict.
The whole perspective really pushes against our modern tendency to quantify everything, doesn't it? We love metrics GDP, military spending, megatons.
Would you?
But this source forces us, and you listening, to consider power qualitatively, to look for strength in the invisible in character, conviction, clarity of purpose. It's basically asking for a fundamental reevaluation of what truly underpins security and success, looking at the moral foundations.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive today.
Yeah.
We've traced this concept of moral physics all the way from its prototype at the Battle of Badr,
Through those critical lessons in discipline at Uhud and Khandaq.
and culminating in the strategic mastery shown by Khalid ibn al-Walid at Yarmouk, applying speed, maneuver, and psychological depth.
And the connecting thread, the argument woven throughout the source material we examined, is pretty clear. Quality, when it's guided by strong moral conviction, rigorous discipline, and a unified sense of purpose, consistently overcomes quantity.
Right. These historical events aren't presented as just, isolated moments in religious history. They're framed as timeless strategic lessons, a kind of syllabus for achieving lasting security and success.
And the challenge laid out by the source isn't just about knowing the history. It's about actively applying those core principles, character, discipline, unity, to the challenges we face right now, whether they're geopolitical, organizational, or even personal.
Exactly. It's about activating those principles.
So as we wrap up, let's bring it back to that core thesis one last time. Using the source's own concluding thought, the past was our teacher, the future is our test.
And then there's that final, striking statement that really encapsulates the whole argument connecting history to the present, specifically regarding Pakistan's defense posture. The source asserts, Pakistan is not building new weapons, it is reawakening an old principle.
That's a powerful closing image, tying ancient conviction directly to modern capability, bringing us right back to where we started.
It brings it all full circle.
And on that note, we'll leave you with the definitive and certainly provocative closing slogan provided in the source material we analyzed today, something for you to reflect on. Pakistan Zindabad, the next world superpower.